Thank you for joining us for today's JINSA webinar. We are honored to have joining us today General Robert Ashley, General Richard Natonsky, and Professor Jeffrey Korn. General Ashley is the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He participated in JINSA's 2021 Generals and Admirals program and is a member of our Gaza Assessment Policy Project. General Natonsky is the former commander of U.S. Marine Corps Forces Command. He is a member of JINSA's Gaza Assessment Policy Project and Hybrid Warfare Task Force. Professor Korn is a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. He is the George R. Killam Jr. Chair of Criminal Law and Director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University School of Law. He is also a member of JINSA's Gaza Assessment Policy Project and Hybrid Warfare Task Force. General Ashley, General Natonsky, and Professor Korn will be assessing the latest Gaza conflict. This discussion will be moderated by Ari Chickerell, JINSA Senior Policy Analyst. During the webinar, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on the screen. For those in the audience, you are automatically muted and your video is off. I would like to invite Ari to start the discussion.
Thank you, Ethan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ari Chickerell, a JINSA Senior Policy Analyst. I want to thank the panelists and viewers for joining in this timely conversation. As Ethan mentioned, the panelists are all members of JINSA's Gaza Assessment Policy Project that examined the May 2021 conflict between Israel and Gaza, which you can find on JINSA's website. You can also find on JINSA's website analysis of Operation Breaking Dawn, written by myself, JINSA's Vice President for Policy, Blaise Mishtal, and Andrew Galili, a Senior Policy Analyst at JINSA. Our discussion today will examine the recent fighting between Israel and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as how Israel's operations have changed over time. With that, General Ashley, I'll start with you to set the stage for the conversation. What was Israel's Operation Breaking Dawn, and what are your overall assessments of the escalation that took place between Israel and Gaza from August 5th to 7th?
Hey, Ari, thanks for having all of us today. Always a pleasure to be here with JINSA and kind of your extended community. I'll spend just about 90 seconds. Let me just give you kind of a profile of what Operation Breaking Dawn was. And I know we're going to get into some of the nuances of strategy at the operations strategic level and talk about some of the parties that were part of the conflict and how this broke out. But just for the audience, Operation Breaking Dawn over 3 days, beginning on August 5th, it was an operation initiated by Israel against the Iranian-backed Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a terrorist organization, designated a terrorist organization by the U.S., by Israel, and all of our Five Eyes partners. It was a limited, precise number of airstrikes with the intent to kill commanders of both that ended up killing commanders of both the northern and southern divisions in Gaza of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The IDF said that it struck 170 PIJ targets, which included not only the individuals, but military posts, attack tunnels, launch sites, and weapon facilities. And while most of the conflicts in Gaza have not been Israeli initiated, this one can be described as a preemptive strike against PIJ planned attacks. And preemption is one of the key subjects that we're going to talk about today. And I know Professor Korn will address that. The Israeli goal really was to restore deterrence against PIJ and send a deterrence signal to others that are Iranian-backed, such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and I would say also a deterrent message to go to Iran as well. The operation achieved its limited objectives. It wasn't an enduring peace, but it was to eliminate PIJ's top leadership, reduce the war materials in Gaza while preventing Hamas from getting involved. And obviously, paramount objective always is the safety of the Israeli citizenry. And to add to those objectives quickly, really, the objective always is to try to achieve those before peace is reinstated. And we've seen that in the last couple of conflicts where the IDF has ratcheted up operations rather quickly to move at a quicker pace than they have back like in 2014. The IDF also engaged in an improved, but not a perfect information campaign, disseminating information faster than they had in previous conflicts. I think that's another key point to pull out in the conversation now as we move this forward, and what kind of communications the IDF and Israel as a nation will engage in, even though the conflict came to a ceasefire on 7 August. The actual exchange itself, PIJ launched probably about 1,100 rockets and mortars into Israel, with really the intent of trying to overwhelm Israel's Iron Dome defense system, probably double what they did in the conflict in 2019 when they were firing against Israel. And of the projectiles that were fired, I'd say probably about 20% of those actually fell within Gaza itself and created Palestinian casualties. Iron Dome continues to improve in its ability to intercept. It intercepted approximately about 96% of the projectiles that were launched in proximity of Israeli populations. And that's a key point where Iron Dome is deployed to support the Israeli population. PIJ launched probably about the same rate as they did before, and what they fired was a significant increase over past conflicts. And as this transpired quickly over a weekend, lasting 3 days, Egypt weighed in and they brokered a ceasefire that went into effect at 11:30 p.m. on 7 August. And Ari, back to you. That's kind of just the basic outline of what took place, and then we'll kind of disaggregate some of those points and talk to them in further detail. Thanks.
Thank you, General Ashley. I'm certain we'll return to many of those points throughout the conversation. Lieutenant Colonel Korn, I'll ask, what are your overall impressions of the escalation that took place? As well as General Ashley mentioned, Operation Breaking Dawn began as a preemptive strike. So I'll ask you, what's the difference between a preemptive and a preventative strike? And what are the legal requirements to beginning an operation like the strikes that Israel took as compared to responding after a strike against Israel has already occurred? Lieutenant Colonel Korn.
That'll help. Yeah. Well, every nation in the world has, pursuant to Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, an inherent right of self-defense. And it's really no different than if you think of yourself out in a bar some night and somebody launches an aggressive attack against you. Obviously, if you're punched in the nose, you have been the victim of an attack and you have a right to take necessary and proportionate measures to defend yourself from further attack. But you don't have to wait until you get hit. When that attack is imminent, then under any theory of law, you have a right to preempt becoming the victim of that attack. And the law of self-defense for states functions identically. When a state makes an assessment that there's an imminent threat of an unlawful armed attack, then the state has authority under international law to use necessary and proportionate force to preempt that or intercept that attack. Now, the challenge is that, you know, if you do this in a bar fight and you're charged with an aggravated battery for punching someone, then there's going to be a court or a judge that's going to adjudicate whether or not you made the right judgment of imminence. When a state acts preemptively, it's the international community that's making that judgment. And there's always tremendous risk, because there's always the risk that the perception will be that the state acted prematurely, and therefore it was the state that claimed self-defense that was actually the party that engaged in aggression. What I would suggest in regard to Israel is that Israel's history tells us that normally it does in fact wait to be the victim of the first blow. And in many cases, I think that's because of a recognition of how challenging it is to defend its action when it acts preemptively. There are two significant historical events where Israel did act preemptively and suffered significantly in the international kind of diplomatic domain. The 1967 Six-Day War, where they launched the preemptive attack, and the response was sufficient to make them far more hesitant to do so in 1973, which led them to be the victim of the attack in the Yom Kippur War, and the attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor, because they believed that they couldn't afford to allow Iraq to get enriched uranium to make a weapon. So when you see Israel striking the first blow, at least for me, it suggests that the intelligence they had was actionable and accurate and very compelling, that the enemy was on the verge of launching an illegal armed attack against them. And that's what's required for establishing imminence. Now, you ask, what's the difference between preemptive and preventive self-defense. International law really doesn't acknowledge the legitimacy of preventive self-defense. There was a lot of talk about this in 2003 when the United States invaded Iraq, because a lot of the rhetoric was related to what some people call the Bush doctrine of preventive self-defense. In fact, what that really reflected was, I think, a very pragmatic recognition that when you're dealing with non-state threats, you don't have the luxury of waiting till the last minute because you might not be able to detect the attack. They're not getting ready to launch missiles or firing up jets on a runway that you're watching with your intelligence. And therefore, the idea of imminence has been stretched by the United States and other states when you're dealing with kind of non-state terrorist-oriented organizations, and the state makes a judgment that this is the last feasible opportunity to preempt what they believe is an imminent attack. Now, we don't know the details of why Israel concluded that the threat was imminent, but that's their job to defend. They took the first blow, so really the burden is on Israel to justify why the threat from PIJ was in fact imminent under the circumstances. At that point, they have a right to act. In terms of the way they acted, I don't think there's much argument that it was an excessive use of self-defense force. It was a very limited operation, very narrowly tailored and sufficiently managed and executed so that they didn't draw Hamas into the conflict, which actually is probably the best evidence that the response they took was proportionate to the threat, which was the obligation.
Thank you, and we'll return to concepts of law of armed conflict later on in the conversation, dealing with once an operation is actually begun. But General Natonsky, I'd like to turn to you for your overall impressions, as well as ask you in the report that the Gaza Assessment Policy Project put together about the May 2021 war, you identified a strategic mismatch with Israel having only operational goals in Gaza, not strategic ones. Did the latest operation and its attempt to preempt Palestinian Islamic Jihad attacks reflect a change in Israel's approach since 2021? And what do you think the IDF learned since the May 2021 war?
Well, I'll set the background. Going back to 2007, when Hamas took over control of the Gaza Strip, Israel, as we spoke in our report last year, really had no defined strategic end state. They had operational objectives, which were primarily to deter Hamas from any further conflicts, i.e. try to buy quiet time. And if they did have to fight Hamas, they wanted to degrade their military capabilities to the maximum extent possible. They utilized a doctrine called momentum in 2021, which effectively meant they used a swift, massive use of force while limiting the risk to civilians and try to limit the duration of the conflict. In 2007, as I mentioned, they had this policy of trying to basically deter Hamas. The alternative to a strategic end state would actually mean going in and taking over the Gaza Strip again. And that, I think, is a non-starter from the IDF and Israel's position. It would mean tremendous casualties on both sides, tremendous damage to the infrastructure. So in effect, they have avoided that type of strategy. To contrast that with Hamas, Hamas realizes that they are not going to win on the battlefield. They know they cannot beat Israel militarily. Their focus from a strategic perspective is more on information. In 2021, the point they wanted to get across was they are there to defend Jerusalem. They are there to win more support and improve their standing among the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. They wanted to discredit the Israeli Defense Force's pretty effective measures to minimize risks to civilians. And this came about through their violations of the law of armed conflict, which I know we'll get on later. plus they wanted to deflect attention from the ongoing economic problems in the Gaza Strip. Hamas really cares more about the public perception than what happens on the battlefield. And they have primarily two audiences. They have an Arab audience and they have the international audience. And in terms of what they try to do is to show that Israel is violating the law of armed conflict by using civilian shields, protected structures, essentially targeting civilians while limiting the media in the Gaza Strip to seeing only what they want them to see. And then any casualties that come about are essentially the fault of the IDF. Now, when we look at 2022 and Breaking Dawn, which occurred earlier this month, I think there was a little bit of a change to their operational strategy or operational plans with respect to this recent strike. One, as Professor Korn mentioned, it was a preemptive attack on the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. That was different. And as he mentioned, the fear of doing a preemptive attack on Hamas or any other adversary has always brought fear to the Israelis because of the concern over international condemnation. Another point that Professor Korn brought up was to restore deterrence against not only Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but in particular Hezbollah, that next time we aren't going to wait for you to attack. And we have to understand that Iran is essentially behind all of these adversaries. I think they were effective in preventing Hamas intervention. They targeted only the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And since 2022, they've improved their information operations. They had specialized information operations cell that released videos and maps in a much more timely manner than they had last year. And they also studied the adversaries' IO messaging. And then I think, in my own personal opinion, we have seen the growth, the lessons learned that technology can provide, how effective technology has been over time as we had these previous conflicts. We've seen how we can detect tunnels. The Iron Dome effectiveness is constantly improved, precision guided munitions, which help reduce civilian casualties and the use of drones. However, I still feel the long-term strategy, if there is one in Israel, is to buy quiet time, to deter Hamas from any more strikes, and if they do, to strike back massively. But what they want to do is to buy quiet time. And I'm not sure, but it seems the fact that the Israelis have now started to increase the number of Palestinians coming into Israel to work from a number of around 7,000 last year. It's grown to 14,000 with an intent to grow even further, perhaps to 20,000. This brings economic support to the Gazans, to the Palestinian people. And I think Hamas has to be a little careful that if Israel closes the gates and prohibits these workers from coming into Israel to make a living, the Palestinian people are going to be upset at Hamas. Not that Hamas, who uses terror tactics to keep their people in line, but I think it's something that might help in the future. And that's kind of wraps it up there.
General Ashley, building off of something General Natansky was just mentioning, in the fact that Hamas did not get involved in the conflict, do you think that the fact that Hamas stayed out of this recent conflict is a success of the 2021 operation in reestablishing deterrence against the group?
I mean, I think it does. It carries over from a deterrence standpoint, because you want to choose your battles when you're in the best opportunity to achieve your strategic or your operational objectives. The degree to which Hamas was depleted, their infrastructure was attacked, the impacts, I mean, they're still in a rebuilding phase from that. So I think deterrence is in fact in place, and that was probably a driving factor for them not becoming involved in this latest round. In addition to, I think there was some communications from the IDF to Hamas to stay out of this because it was very strategic and limited in its objectives from the Israeli standpoint based on the intelligence they had. So, but it doesn't, these are operational issues that are resolved in these conflicts, not strategic issues. And the strategic issues, as General Natanz talked about, is just how much quiet time have you bought yourself? Because deterrence is not static; it evolves, and the conditions on the ground are constantly changing. So at some point, Hamas, will either make a decision to reinitiate hostilities, or there may be more pressure on them based on what's taking place, which I really think is at the strategic level for Israel, which is bringing in 14,000 Palestinians to be able to work, going to 20,000 to put enough pressure on Hamas to not have these perturbations of conflict, but to start taking more responsibility in the role that they have really is, as they've been in since 2007, which is the sovereign of Gaza, and to take that responsibility serious with a long-term strategy on how they're going to be able to help the Palestinian people.
General Natansky, Israel faces a significantly more dangerous threat to its north in Lebanon and Syria, with Hezbollah's large missile stockpile and Iran looking to proliferate advanced provisioned weaponry. What challenges does this larger threat pose to Israel's operational planning for Gaza, as well as how it affects the quiet that you mentioned that they seek?
Well, I think Israel has to be prepared for threats emanating from Gaza. That's kind of watching your flank, but their primary focus has to be on the north, both Syria and Lebanon with Hezbollah, as you have mentioned. Hezbollah, in effect, is a proxy of Iran. They're a hybrid threat. Although they are not a nation state, they possess all the sophisticated weaponry and military capabilities that many nation states do have. In addition, they get somewhere between $700 and $800 million a year directly from Iran, and about another $200 million through illegal activities, money laundering, drugs, etc. What the threat really resides in the north is the 120 to 140,000 or even more rockets and missiles. Missiles being precision guided, rockets meaning you point them in the general direction and hope they hit what you want them to. In addition to those rockets, they have about a 25,000 man active duty force, combat trained in Syria, fighting in the Syrian civil war, plus another 20 to 30,000 reserves. They've got tunnels, drones, sophisticated anti-aircraft and anti-ship missiles, mines. So they have a sophisticated military capability. What we have seen, and we would believe they would resort to Hezbollah if they were to attack from the north, one would be to try to overwhelm the Iron Dome system. Instead of shooting maybe 100 or 200, maybe even 400 rockets at a time, we might expect anywhere between 1,000 and 4,000 rockets and missiles every day. And that, in effect, would overwhelm the Iron Dome. This would essentially disrupt the economy of Israel because they would be targeting airports, ports like Haifa, nuclear facilities, chemical facilities, desalination plants, along with civilian population centers. The IDF and the Iron Dome would have to focus their protection on military installations, because in order to react from attacks from Hezbollah, the IDF would then have to attack back, and they'd have to protect those assets as they're in their assembly areas getting ready to strike north. In addition to overwhelming the Iron Dome, I think we could expect incursions into northern Israel, not deep, but using tunnels, which we've already seen. IDF has uncovered at least 10 tunnels on the northern border. But the intent by Hezbollah would be to go in, take hostages, to kill civilians, and to plant a Hezbollah flag for the propaganda victory. In addition, because Israel would have to respond and would attack north, they have extensive defensive positions in Lebanon, built around civilian structures, around civilian homes, much the same as Hamas and PIJ does in Gaza, all with the intent to inflict massive casualties on the Israelis, undermine the use of the law of armed conflict by the IDF, and achieve international condemnation on Israel when civilians are killed. Throw into the mix now Syria. You could see the potential for attacks coming from the Golan Heights, emanating from Syria. So you could have, worst case, attacks coming across the Lebanese border, attacks coming from Syria into the Golan, and attacks coming from Gaza Strip. So although the IDF has to pay attention to the threat in Gaza, they also have to be much more focused on the greater threat in the northern region.
Thank you, General Natonsky. I think that provides some important context to Israel's multitude of threats and multitude of adversaries that it has to face and prepare to face. I'd like to invite any of our viewers to ask questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and then I will be happy to ask the panelists those questions. Lieutenant Colonel Korn, what are you discussed the considerations for a preemptive strike before an operation begins. Now I'd like to ask you, what are the legal obligations when choosing targets and executing airstrikes, both either before or during once an operation has already begun? And what steps does Israel take to ensure it meets or exceeds those obligations? Lieutenant Colonel Korn, you're on mute still.
I'd be careful with the rhetoric of exceeding. I mean, if you're meeting the obligation, then you're satisfying the requirement. Look, it's a three-part test, right? First, you have to make sure that as best you can under the circumstances, that what you're attacking qualifies as a valid military target under the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law, whatever we want to call the law of war. But what makes something a military objective? If you're an individual, you're a member of the enemy organized armed group. If you are, if it's a piece of property, a building, a car, a field, then it's making an effective use to the enemy's war effort, and your destruction or neutralization will offer you a definite military advantage under the circumstances. So that's the first question. If it's not a military target, it's off limits from deliberate attack. Once you decide it's a target, if you know that attacking it will pose risk to civilians or civilian property, you have to consider feasible precautionary measures, things like verifying the nature of the target, using a precision weapon system to mitigate civilian risk, issuing warnings, adjusting the timing of your attack to a time that poses the least civilian risk, considering whether there are other targets that will give you the same military advantage without creating the same danger to civilian population. Once you've exhausted those feasible precautions, and feasible means that under the circumstances, it's not going to compromise your military advantage, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Once you exhaust them, then the commander has to make a decision. He has to predict what the civilian casualties will be and the destruction to civilian property, and decide whether or not that collateral damage is going to be excessive compared to the military advantage he anticipates from launching the attack. You know, most people think of collateral damage as unintended damage. It's quite the opposite. It's anticipated damage or injury to civilians, and it's a very heavy burden for combat commanders to carry, because they know that their attack has a high probability of killing or injuring civilians, and they have to make the judgment that that price is worth paying, or that price pays its way to achieve the military advantage. So the idea that whenever there's a civilian casualty, it indicates illicit warfare is simply inaccurate, and it's unrealistic. There was a lot of press about children that were killed, and that's a tragedy. And I'm sure that the Israeli commanders who authorized those attacks are, bearing the burden of knowing that their decision led to that result, but it doesn't mean it was unlawful. We'd have to know what the target was and what measures were taken to avoid that risk and whether they were feasible. You know, the Israelis often issue warnings. Obviously, if you're going to conduct a preemptive attack, it's not feasible to warn the enemy that you're coming. I mean, the whole idea is to get tactical and operational surprise. This is one of the dangers we've talked about in previous reports. Just because you do something in one operation doesn't mean you have to do it in the next operation. This is a good illustration of that. The need for operational and tactical surprise meant that it wasn't realistic to expect the commanders to issue the type of pre-attack warnings that had been issued in prior conflicts. I think the narrow nature of the operation, the speed in which it was executed, and as I said earlier, the fact that it didn't kind of bleed over to draw Hamas into the conflict is a manifestation of the precision and accuracy in terms of target selection that the Israelis can implement, particularly when they're conducting an operation of this type. So you say, what do they do to implement these obligations? They train their people, they develop capabilities, they war game those capabilities. They spend a lot of time focusing on lessons learned from the last conflict. They're always trying to improve. They're always trying to improve the ability to achieve their military objectives in a way that mitigates as much as possible to the risk to the civilian population. And sadly, that's rarely the case on the other side of the conflict, where there seems to be not only very little interest in mitigating civilian risk, but in many situations, it appears that these enemies are trying to increase the risk to their civilian population in order to gain the benefit in the strategic information domain of civilian casualty.
I would add also that the IDF operation that killed Taisir al-Jabari, one of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad commanders, was a weapon that only took out the specific apartment he was in, as opposed to destroying the entire building or multiple floors of that building. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to do a legal analysis of whether they could have used a different weapon. But it seems that the specific choice to use that weapon certainly mitigated risks of that could have been done to civilians elsewhere. And I think there's also, whether it was a legal analysis, I think there's also an information warfare component in that that by only destroying the specific apartment he was in, there were not civilian casualties.
But there's also a moral component of the IDF arming its commanders with these type of precision capabilities, because ultimately those commanders who order those attacks have to live with the consequences. So don't we want them to have the type of weapon systems that enable them to achieve those objectives in that type of way, as opposed to having to inflict greater destruction? I mean, one of the pieces here that we tend to overlook is that the commanders and the soldiers and the airmen that are executing these operations, they're not robots, they're moral beings. They have to live with the consequences of their actions. So I think it's an important aspect of implementing that precautions obligation that you're constantly seeking to develop weapon systems that enhance the balance between legitimate combat violence and the protection of the civilian population.
And on the other side, as you noted, Israel's adversaries in Gaza, be it Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, do not have those same moral considerations. So Lieutenant Colonel Korn, how do Palestinian terrorist groups like those that I mentioned violate international law?
Well, I mean, the most obvious violation is indiscriminate rocket attacks against Israel. They're not targeting military objectives. Remember, I said the first thing is if it's not a military objective, you can't deliberately attack it. They don't care about that. To them, the military objective is the state of Israel. And if you're a civilian that gets blown up by one of their rockets, so be it. In many cases, they see that as a good thing. So they're not trying to attack military targets for the most part. But I think what's even more troubling, and I've written about this, I call it indirect civilian targeting. They know that if they put their most important objectives in the midst of the civilian population, The Israelis will do things to mitigate that risk, but in the end, they're going to be compelled to attack. And so they're almost in a way using the Israeli military as their agent to attack their own civilian population in order to gain the informational benefit. That's worse than human shielding. If I ask my two general officer colleagues, is human shielding improper in warfare? They would instinctively say, yeah, that's awful. You're not supposed to use civilians to try and immunize your target. They're not trying to immunize their target. They're trying to get the civilians killed in many cases, which is an aggravated form of human shielding. And so we could spend an hour talking about the pervasive disregard for the international rules of war manifested by all of these enemies that Israel faces. And to be clear, that doesn't give Israel a license to ignore the law itself, because that would really be pernicious, because then the civilian is the victim of both sides. But there is an irony that you have the IDF trying to mitigate civilian risk, the Palestinian forces trying to exacerbate it, when it's the Palestinian civilian population that bears the brunt of conflict.
And as you noted, the Palestinian groups are allowing and inviting attacks against them, whereas Israel has developed numerous air defense systems, in particular Iron Dome, which performed exceptionally well during this conflict, intercepting around 96% of incoming rockets compared to 90% during the May 2021 conflict. General Ashley, U.S. forces and regional partners in the Middle East have also faced Iran-backed projectile threats. And one of the policy recommendations that JINSA has made is developing a regional integrated air defense system. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on developing such a system and how the region would go about accomplishing that.
So that's an incredibly complex task. If you're following the news as of late, you'll know that General Kurilla has been, I think he's made 5 trips into the region since taking over Central Command. This was one of the topics that he spoke about last time. They were hoping this would be a topic for the president when he was in the Middle East. The complexity of putting that in place is one that's based, fundamentally on trust. Because when you talk about integrating, you're talking about sharing communications, you're talking about sharing technology, you're talking about sharing tactics, techniques, and procedures. You're talking about sharing intelligence, and there's different categories of information. I think there's 8 categories of information. Intel's one of them, order of battle's one, details on weapon systems is one. So just imagine the challenge between nations which have been historically at odds with one another, even though we're seeing progress, which is great in the right direction, and Israel's leaning forward to integrate communications, to integrate weapon systems, indications and warning, sharing communications at a level where maybe you're exchanging some crypto, how you're moving that around, how you do early warning nets for inbound missiles or attacks, and we'll say from Iran in this use case. So there's a high degree of complexity. They've got to work through the framework of how they do that. I think integration is ultimately where you want to be, and we're not fully integrated in the US systems. I mean, JADC2 is something that we're trying to achieve. So I think what you really are looking at is deconfliction and coordination. How would you put LNOs in various nations and capitals? How would you put an Israeli LNO in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, in Bahrain? And then how would you, work targeting solutions and deconflict the ability to protect those nations? So there's a lot of layers to that. Policy and authorities start, is where it starts. This isn't a technical problem that's solvable. The engineering, the technology, and everything behind that is doable. The challenge is the policies, the authorities to be able to integrate, and really building trust over time to be able to put an integrated defense net, in place. There is the Middle East Air Defense Initiative, which is ongoing. There's discussions to that effect. There's discussions from Central Command, from the Israelis, and this will mature over time. But this is a pretty heavy lift. So this is kind of a crawl, walk, run in terms of the approach. You got to figure out how do you deconflict and coordinate before you can really integrate. at the speed of war.
General Natansky, Palestinians in Gaza claimed that an Israeli strike was responsible for killing civilians. In particular, there was an incident on August 6th in which 4 children died. How did Israel counter this claim, and what role does countering misinformation and disinformation play in achieving strategic success?
Before I get to that, I'd just like to, I guess, jump on what Professor Korn mentioned about Hamas and other adversaries using civilians primarily to shelter launchers, other military installations, using protected structures like hospitals and mosques and schools. This is a threat that not just Israel faces. The United States faces these same threats. We saw these in Iraq, and it's something that the U.S. has to be prepared to face in any future conflicts. I think the value of these GINSA reports that we have participated in is the fact that we take a lot of lessons that the IDF has learned and bring them back so we can be better prepared as the United States and the security of the United States to meet the same types of threats that Israel is meeting. So along those lines, we certainly see the use of how adversaries try to use the law of armed conflict in the information arena against us. And this latest iteration earlier this month is no different. As you mentioned, on August 6th, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad accused Israeli of killing a number of civilians, including 4 children. Within an hour, the IDF was able to refute those claims, and within 24 hours, they had released a map and video footage of what turned out to be a rocket launched by PIDGE towards Israel that fell short and actually killed those civilians. So they were able to refute that. And of course, that's critical in the court of public opinion. I think one of the lessons learned from 2021 in the last Gaza conflict was Israel has gotten better with a response to claims like this. There was an attack on a building last year that housed the Associated Press along with Al Jazeera. And as Professor Korn mentioned, the Israeli Defense Forces have gone to extremes in the past. Things like a knock on the roof, leaflets, telephone calls, text messages to occupants of certain targets, warning them to evacuate to minimize the amount of casualties. Can't do that in a preventive attack, but in the case of the attack on the building that housed AP, what was not announced at the time, but there was a sophisticated electronic warfare capability in that building. And as a result, the IDF attacked it. But unlike this recent conflict, it took almost a week before the IDF identified what was in that building, and they lost the messaging in the information war. So I think it's important that Israel continues to do that. And I think they have gotten to the point where they are much more responsive in the information operations arena, as I mentioned earlier with the cells. But I think it's also important, not only for the Israelis, but for the United States to educate the public on the fact that there are going to be civilian casualties. And unfortunately, they are legitimate under the law of armed conflict. That as hard as Israeli defense forces and the United States go to the extremes to try to avoid casualties using precision-guided munitions and intelligence, they're still going to happen. Now, on the 7th, the next day, there was another attack in which some additional children were killed. Initially, the IDF once again blamed the PIDGE on those casualties, But then after investigating, the IDF saw that no, there were no rockets that landed in that area. And it was actually the results of an Israeli airstrike. And what did they do? They went public and said those civilian casualties were the result of the IDF. You'll never see Hamas or any of Israel's other adversaries saying those civilians were killed because they were next to a rocket launcher or next to a headquarters of Hamas. So it's important, I think, that the rapid dissemination of information to counter your adversary's claims is critical. And I think, unlike Hezbollah, Hamas, the PIJ, democracies need the support of the public. And the only way they're going to gain the support is through telling the truth. When you lose the support, you can look at the Vietnam War. By 68 in the Tet Offensive, popular support for the Vietnam War was waning in the United States and ultimately led to a withdrawal. So it's important. And I think it's a lesson we learned last year studying the conflict in Gaza, but that information domain is critical to the success of any operation. It's not just hardware, be it rockets, artillery, airstrikes. The information domain, as we see Hamas as their strategic information, that is number one, is to gain international support in that arena. So,
or if I can jump in real quick, I just have a question for Professor Korn. So one of the things that we didn't talk about was a legal requirement to justify, right? Or, talk to the evidence that you had on a preemptive strike. We talk about legal sufficiency, but, Jeff, could you talk a little bit about, because I can take the backside of that, which is, if you have intelligence to that effect, are you going to disclose it? But, the International Criminal Court, no one's going to necessarily drag you in to say, well, you didn't come back and, you have a burden of proof on, preemption based on what you knew. Over.
Lieutenant Colonel Korn, you're still muted.
Okay, maybe I'm better that way. There are a couple of layers to the answer. You bring up the International Criminal Court. Actually, the International Criminal Court's most latest crime is the crime of aggression. It was very controversial, was not included in the first draft of the treaty. So in theory, national leaders who authorize a preemptive attack that are subject to the jurisdiction of the court could at some point find themselves having to share that information. That's highly unlikely. It's mainly a diplomatic issue. Technically, when a state acts in self-defense, it's obligated to immediately notify the Security Council, provide notice to the Security Council that it acted in self-defense. The idea of the original UN Charter was that the Security Council would then be able to kind of take over the situation and protect the state and resolve the dispute. We know that doesn't happen. That's been a failure. So the extent of disclosure in many ways, I think, is going to be driven by the perceived diplomatic and political risk of not being forthcoming with information and balancing that against what you're giving up. And when you're dealing with an ongoing threat, I mean, you're the intelligence expert, not me, but it would seem kind of self-evident that if I know this threat is going to continue to be out there, I have to be very careful about revealing information so that they're not tipped off on how I knew that they were going to do what they were about to do. It's a very difficult situation. I mean, we were all in uniform in 2003 when President Bush authorized the invasion of Iraq, and there was significant diplomatic blowback as a result of that. Allies that were incredibly sympathetic and supportive after 9/11 started to move away from us. I was in Germany at the time, and I remember the stark contrast between the German public reaction after 9/11 versus the reaction in March of 2003 or February of 2003 when we launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. So I think national leaders huddled with their senior military advisors, have to make a calculated decision. How much risk am I assuming? Is it worth it? And I think part of it, General, that is often overlooked, it's the point General Natonsky just made. Legitimacy is not just going to be about how you execute the war. It's going to be about why you're fighting the war. And I don't know that there's enough kind of thought that goes into how are we going to defend our position when the heat starts coming down internationally, or do we care? I don't know if that answered, but
Yeah, it does, because you said the key word, which is risk, and then what's the long-term impact? So if you're thinking placement and access, sources and methods that are related to intelligence, you're not necessarily going to disclose that in advance of a preemptive strike. But if you feel this, the diplomatic burden of proof post-strike to share, then you've got to weigh the decision of the risk of, does disclosing this, source have a long-term impact that is beyond the value that I get of talking about how we knew what took place. Now, the other part is depending on the details. You see a lot of stuff in open source information, public available information that you can use that to obfuscate where you may have actually gotten it from when you look at commercial imagery and things like that. But when you start getting into human intelligence, signal intelligence, the obfuscation is much more problematic in that sense. So, and it really is, national leaders and decision makers that make those decisions. And, the intel folks are in the room to talk about, here's the potential impact and the risk to compromising a source. In some cases, you may not be compromising a source, and the blowback's not that much, but all of that has to be weighed in. And I think you characterize it well as it really plays more out diplomatically in terms of your relationships with other nations to help them understand. In some cases, in advance, as we saw in May of last year, had we had a more robust conversation between the Israeli and the U.S. governments on the Al Jalal strike, that would have been moving toward mitigation based on what subsequently took place, which was pressure after the fact to talk about an electronic capability, warfare capability that would put Iron Dome at risk. But it took a lot of pressure to get to that point in the conversation, as opposed to getting there early on.
And let's not overlook the fact that in many cases it's the military that's kind of carrying the burden of this risk. Just imagine how different the narrative in the conflict in Ukraine would have been if Ukraine had launched a preemptive attack against the Russians. I mean, I think legally they would have had the right to do it, but the cost that they would have paid in terms of public perception wasn't worth it. And so their military had to just wait for the inevitable, which was the attack.
Yeah, but I think, the preemption preventive strikes, we didn't go into in detail, but you could go back to look at going against the Syrian nuclear plant, probably preventive, going after the Iraqi nuclear plant, preventive. And then there's the bigger discussion of, the Iranian capability. At what point, if they decide to weaponize, at what point is it preemption on the imminence of a capability with a strike and a delivery means, or is it prevention on setting back the program because you took out part of the infrastructure?
Yeah, well, it's for the Americans in the audience, it's interesting because the Bush administration took a lot of heat for introducing the word prevention. But if you actually look carefully at the Obama national security strategy, substantively, it wasn't really that different. They just used a broader definition of imminence, which is really more focused on not that you're about to be attacked, but that this is our last feasible opportunity to prevent what we know is coming, which obviously would be central to any attack related to preventing the enrichment of uranium to build a nuclear weapon. If you lose the ability to stop it at that point, that may be when you have to act.
Yeah, and the other part gets into, we didn't really talk about the changing character of war and the changing weapons. And, you don't have the old days of Napoleonic, hey, I think they're coming because they're all on the border and everybody's, fixed bayonets getting ready to come over. This is very different dynamic. So how much risk do you assume from prevention to preemption on something that is impactful as a nuclear program?
I think that's right. And even different than our early days as intelligence officers, where you had all of the signals and the MASINT information about launch capabilities. It's just different. And so states are more challenged here. And the Security Council is inert. So it really falls on the shoulders of state leaders to decide when to assume this risk.
Lieutenant Colonel Corn, we have a question in from Robin Gottlieb, who asks, in terms of preemptive self-defense, does it matter if the imminent attack by Peach or other terrorists was going to be against civilian population versus military targets?
Yeah, I'm looking at the question. It doesn't matter legally. Either one of them would be an unlawful armed attack against Israel. From a policy standpoint, I would submit that it probably does matter significantly as to whether or not you're going to act preemptively, because you might be much more willing to absorb an attack directed against your armed forces than you are to absorb an attack directed against your civilian population. So I think as a policy matter, it's probably pretty influential, but as a legal matter, I don't think it really changes the equation.
As we are running out of time, I would like to ask the panelists if they have any final thoughts. General Ashley, I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, so we're about a week since the ceasefire is in effect. So the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli government is studying this. So we'll continue to, track this and see what lessons learned or brought forth, and how we share those amongst the community of nations. So we'll continue to work this. Appreciate the opportunity.
Lieutenant Colonel Corn, I'll turn to you next. Any final thoughts?
Nothing from me.
And General Natonsky, I'll lead you with the last thoughts.
All I'd say is that I think there was a lot of lessons learned by the IDF from 2021, and having seen what they did in this recent conflict, it's nice to see items that we pointed out in our study last year almost come to fruition this year. So the value in these studies that we have produced, hopefully are taken on board by the United States as we go out and brief different entities like Department of Defense, Congress, and other audiences. Over.
I want to thank the panelists and viewers for joining us today. You can find all of JINSA's work at jinsa.org, including the Gaza Policy Project Assessment of the May 2021 war and the recap of Operation Breaking Dawn, written by myself, Blaise Mishtal, and Andrew Galili. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Bye, and thank you.